Alan Wake 2 takes place 13 years after the first Alan Wake, where FBI agent Saga Anderson is investigating strange cult murders in the remote town of Bright Falls. Manuscript pages of a new Alan Wake book starts to appear, describing the murders and events before they happen. The supernatural elements continue to grow out of hand, and shadow monsters starts to appear. And if that wasn't bad enough, history itself seems to start to change according to the books, and Saga seems to be the only one realizing it. In parallel to this, Alan is still stuck in the dark place, desperately trying to write the very same book that Saga is reading to escape from the nightmare. If you find that confusing, then I can only tell you that you have seen nothing yet, but more on that later. Alan Wake 2 is a narrative-focused third-person shooter where you play as Alan and Saga. For the most part it is a fairly nice-looking game, and both the Bright Fall Forest and the city of New York can look very impressive. Like many modern games, it looks the best when you are not interacting with it. And while it often looks alright, I don't think the combat is as impressive looking, and there are things you can point to which looks less good. Yet again, ray tracing turns out to be a worthless scammerino, and I couldn't hold a steady 60 FPS with it to save my life, so I disabled it. Despite this, I still had some frame rate issues at times, but at least it was playable. Then again, I might just be an old fool who refuses to use upscaling for 1080p, which seems to be the go-to crutch used for all modern games. Call me crazy, but Alan Wake 2 is blurry enough without upscaling, and sitting here with my crazy expensive man-child GPU, I expect to be able to run games at 1080p. But enough about that, let us talk about the game's story.
Well, our wait is over. Your new book, Initiation, hits the shelves tomorrow.
What?
That's exactly what every reader will be asking. This book is mind-bending. It's so cerebral. I mean, how would you describe it? An auto-fictional thought experiment? A horror story? A postmodern detective story?
There are plenty of things to like, and the live-action actors does a good job, and the cutscenes blends nicely into the game. The story is also full of fun and creative scenes that put a smile on my face.
What's going on here?
You don't have to kill me. You don't have to go get that knife and stab me. You can just give up and go back. Forget about the ritual sacrifice to open the way forward.
The ritual sacrifice to open the way?
And in the beginning I was engaged with the plot and the investigation. It didn't last though. The first Alan Wake also had a lot of weird ideas, but it was still a somewhat grounded experience where you played as Alan trying to get Alice back.
Point there. I'll be waiting.
I'm through being jerked around by
You
you.
want to see your wife alive? Because if you do, you better watch what you say to me.
In the second one, I imagined that the Saga would ground the story, and to some degree she does. But then, within the first sections, it is revealed that she has magical profiling powers that no one reacts naturally to.
Nightingale's heart. Where is it?
While they played cards in the general store, the witch had stolen his heart. Get out of my house.
Nightingale's heart is at the general store, in a fridge.
Saga and her partner also accepts the supernatural a bit too quickly, and very early the story devolves into Saga just doing random stuff since it is mentioned in the manuscript. Alan's sections are also just so out there. He is a writer stuck in a dark place, living through strange events that he is also influencing with his writing, that in turn inspires his writing so that he can write to escape. I mean, man.
That's very meta indeed.
I honestly think it's complete nonsense. That doesn't mean that there aren't cool or fun scenes, but most of what you are doing and the places that you are visiting is complete filler from a story perspective. The result is that both Alan and Saga seems to be just running around visiting random places for very thin reasons. That is never good in a narrative game, but it could be forgiven if the gameplay was very strong, but that is not the case, and in many sections the game is very light on gameplay. Calling some sections walking sims is taking it a bit too far, but it is clearly leaning in that direction. The story is also lacking a strong antagonist.
But yeah, sad to say, I've not written this. I'd remember if I'd written a book, right?
Or maybe it was written by your evil double.
I remember Scratch being pretty cool in American Nightmare. But Scratch is a complete letdown in this game. He is barely in the story, and when he is as generic as it gets. Having an evil twin might be a bit silly, but the story can do a lot of fun stuff with an evil twin, and there is a setup for it, but there is no real payoff, and the climax doesn't work. This is also the case for many other plot points in the game. A lot of things are getting introduced, but they are either not resolved, or they are not resolved in a good way with a proper climax. Remedy is trying to create this shared universe between their recent games, and I am not a big fan of it. The police sheriff from Alan Wake 1 can't return. Instead we need some celebrity actor from Quantum Break as sheriff. And where the hell is Barry?
See this headlamp? It's like a superpower. I can just look at one of those things and they die. It's my flaming eye of Mordor. I wish I didn't say that.
Yeah.
Hey, I want a headlamp.
Last one.
Bastard.
I think it cheapens the experience. It removes what is unique in the setting, and it takes time and attention away from many of the plot points that could have used more development. One of them being Saga. She is a core part of the story, and interesting things happens to her, but she is just very wooden and underdeveloped. Maybe Remedy could cut away just a little bit of their celebrity worshipping nonsense and actually develop their main cast.
That would be great. Okay?
Overall, I don't think the narrative is great. It is not awful, but it is not tight either. It is nice that they have added fun and quirky live action scenes, but that is not a substitution for a strong narrative. Perhaps I can put it like this. A lot of gameplay-focused games have weak narratives that are mostly there to give you an excuse to visit levels. Alan Wake sometimes feels like this, but they just forgot to focus on the gameplay.
Story will go on. To the word. This story is a monster. This story is a
The first thing to bring up about the gameplay is how different the game plays from the first game. Alan Wake 1 had big levels, both in the sense that the levels were huge, but also in the sense that there was a lot of space to move around in when fighting. The focus was on combat. Alan was very mobile and you often ran around dodging enemies and using the light for crowd control. Not so in this game. The levels are smaller and much more crowded, and even the forest feels like a bunch of corridors. The focus is much more on exploration and often you walk around with very little happening. You are also a lot less mobile in this game, and when combat does occur, then it feels a lot more like Resident Evil than Alan Wake 1. Different doesn't mean bad, but it is bad for other reasons. There are plenty of small things I could complain about. I could whine about how the flashlight mechanic is made worse from the previous games. I could complain about how boring the shadows are to fight in Alan's sections. And how annoying the dark cloud attacks are. I could whine about enemies teleporting around like crazy. That the combat is too visually busy with all the effects. That reloading sucks. That you are clunky. That the boss fight sucks. That the enemy variety is poor. And on it goes. All of above are valid points which annoys me. But the big issue in this game is the encounter design. There is very little combat in this game, and when it happens, it is very often against one or two enemies. Often the enemies appear like they are spawned by some crappy AI, and it is just very unsatisfying. I played through some hours of Alan Wake 1 from a previous playthrough, and in that time I was chased through the woods without weapons. There were constant ambushes. I got attacked by a possessed tractor. I got attacked by crows trying to pick me to death when riding a lift. I had to survive wave after wave of enemies while defending. I fought with friendly AI, and there were so many enemies that I had to use flares and flashbangs to survive. Point is that the levels were made up by interesting and very designed encounters. Not so in this game, and the contrast is crazy when playing them back to back. Alan Wake 2 have like 2 or 3 interesting encounters, and in these encounters I actually had some fun with the game, despite the combat's many flaws. It does make it seem that Alan Wake 2 was made by people who don't care the slightest about gameplay. It is such a step down compared to their previous games, and it results in a fairly dull experience. But I might be looking at this from the wrong way. Is this even an action game anymore when there is so little combat? Perhaps I am the dude bro asshole playing a puzzle game and complaining about the lack of guns. I don't know. But what is it then? Is it a horror game? Well, this game's idea of horror is flashing a screaming face on the screen.
Shit. Careful, Saga.
Amnesia would not be proud. Is it a detective game? Well, no. The game have this annoying wall where you put evidence, but it is less about making deductions and more about stating the obvious, and then Saga will use her magical profiling ability to make stuff up. Furthermore, in many situations in the game, I figured out what to do by myself, but the game wouldn't allow me to interact with objects and actually do it, unless I follow the process of putting things on the wall so that Saga can come up with it for me. Hardly a big boy detective game.
Yeah, alright, yes, please. There goes, sorry. This goes here, and that goes there.
1 hour later.
The float, where's the knife? Oh, anything, my float goes very nice. Maybe he needs one. I figured out what the float is missing.
So what is it then? Well, I guess it is a movie game where you walk around in pretty environments to unlock the next cutscene. And if you really like the narrative, then perhaps this is good enough. I didn't though, and so I didn't enjoy my time with the game that much. That doesn't mean that it is awful or unplayable, but I had to force myself to continue playing it. Compare that to Alan Wake 1. That game has its own flaws, but when I replayed it for this review, I just kept on playing it because I had fun. I wish I felt the same about this game.